Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Going to get started here in just a few moments while people join the webinar. Feel free to let us know where you're watching from in the chat box. If you have any questions come to mind, you're welcome to put those in the Q&A as well. Have our friends from NWEA joining us today, and they'll be introducing themselves in a moment. Okay, while more people join the webinar, just a couple reminders. This webinar will be recorded and you'll have access to this afterwards, so feel free to share the registration link, which is the same as what you used before. So feel free to share that with your friends and colleagues if you find this webinar helpful. Like I mentioned, feel free to let us know your questions or comments in the chat box or the Q&A. We'll also be sharing a post-webinar survey towards the end of the webinar, especially if you're interested in a certificate of attendance. We encourage you to complete that. And both myself and our friends from NWEA will be sharing resources with you both during the webinar and afterwards in follow-up. So feel free to check those out as well. So with that, thanks for joining us, and I'll turn it over to Jessica. So thanks so much.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining our webinar today. My name is Jessica Nerum. I'm an executive account manager at NWEA that supports our Catholic partners. Going to start today with a prayer, so please join me. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. O wisdom God, you teach us the ways of truth. Give us who teach the wisdom and knowledge to know how to reach each and every student. Give us an ability to rejoice in successes, both large and small, and to find words of wisdom and encouragement when there are failures. O patient God, you're always with us, encouraging us as we enter the classroom or the Zoom room. Give us an abundance of patience as we learn to juggle our teaching, sanitizing, distancing, and masking while trying to be attentive to the needs of our students. Help us to be patient with ourselves as well. O loving God, you love us beyond measure. Remind us of that love as we look into the eyes of each student before us. Give us a gentle heart, a compassionate heart, and a heart open to receive love. May your wisdom, O God, be our wisdom, your patience, our patience, and your love, our love. In Christ's name, amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Again, thank you for joining us today for this webinar. Joining me also is Dr. Lynne Kulich, who will speak in just a moment.
Jessica, you're on mute.
Was I on mute for the prayer too? We are who we are. We're a non-for-profit organization based in Portland, Oregon. And we're founded by educators for educators. And we're really true to our mission, just like our Catholic schools. We're here to partner to help all kids learn. NWEA supports about 11 million students in the United States who take our MAP growth or MAP Reading Fluency assessments. We're in over 9,100 districts, 45,000 schools, and 145 countries. We also have a dedicated Catholic school team who partners with our Catholic schools and does a lot of focus on Catholic education in our country. Currently, we support about 78 dioceses, 1,500 schools, and are testing just over 425,000 Catholic school students. So we're very excited to partner with dioceses, archdioceses, and individual schools in our country. We'd also like to let you know that we are here to help you in using your EAMS funding, your title funding to support your needs. So if we think about those federal funds, my colleague is going to drop into the chat about a link for resources on federal funds. Thinking about those funds, we want to think about how are we addressing that unfinished learning to working towards proficiency and achievement goals for our students. So the MAP suite and NWEA professional learning are those right tools to help you both during the school year and during the summer. So how do we administer high quality assessments, track progress, and differentiate learning? Finding that formative assessment practices and those evidence-based activities, providing information and reports to assist not only parents, families, and teachers. And then how do we improve our engagement with all students? So please don't hesitate to reach out to us and visit the website, nwea.org, for more ways in which we can support you with using your funding resources. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Lynne Kulich, who is going to talk to you about early literacy.
It just
Lynne
got
is going to log back in. I think she's frozen. This would be a great opportunity. You could check out the link, the nwea.org, found in your chat. Or if you have some pertinent questions about learning loss, that unfinished learning. I saw somebody put a message in the chat that they like that better than saying learning loss, that unfinished learning. Thank you for your patience. I'm sure many of you have learned that while you're working with technology in your classrooms, you always cross your fingers and say a little prayer for it to work appropriately. All right, turning it over to my esteemed colleague.
Yes, I'm back.
That's all right. We talked about the grace and space to get through technology.
I was booted out, so I actually am using a different internet device. So hopefully that's going to work. And good afternoon, everyone. It is really a pleasure to join you. And I tell you what I'm going to do now that you've seen me on video. I'm going to turn off my video in hopes that that will help sort of with the bandwidth so that we don't lose me again here. So there we go. All right.
And then Lynn, if you could share your slides with us, please.
Yes, absolutely. Okay. All right. We should be good here. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and talk about this for a moment. Is there a literacy crisis? Well, the short answer is yes. But what's important to understand is this crisis really isn't necessarily a consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic, but rather the root cause or causes, I think, can be traced back decades ago. So let's go ahead and take a look at what the research suggests. So the National Center for Education Statistics is really this data warehouse, and it houses a plethora of research about education. And what I've done is pull out three what I think are key points from the most recent 2019 data. 35% of fourth graders, now this is nationally, can read at or above the proficient level. Number two, 82% of students eligible for free or reduced lunch aren't reading at or above the proficient level. And then finally, of the 10 to 15% of students who unfortunately will drop out of school, over 75% of them will report difficulties learning to read. Well, I think we can probably agree, these are not positive statistics at all. But what's even more daunting is if we look back 2 decades ago, let's look at data from the National Center of Education Statistics for 2001, 3, 5, 7, etc. And what we'll discover is the data aren't significantly different, which basically tells us we're not moving the needle for students. Now, I really want to be clear that, any suggestion that we're not growing students is certainly not because we haven't tried. I'm a former elementary teacher myself, and in 2001, I was teaching 27 first graders. And, I was using what I thought were the best assessments and instructional resources and practices at my disposal. But what we know is we've got to make some changes if, in fact, this data is going to change. Let's also look at some NAEP data. So what you see on the screen is a map of the country, and it's highlighting any potential progress fourth grade students made from 2017 to 2019 as far as fourth grade reading is concerned. 17 states saw decreases in their fourth grade reading scores, and one of those states is my own, which is Ohio. 34 states saw no significant change. But what's really interesting is Mississippi was the only state showing improvement. And this is going to be an important point here in the next moment. If we look at the National Council of Teacher Quality, they published a study in 2020. And what they did is they looked at traditional program coverage for those teacher prep courses, so at the college university level, and they looked at the big 5 reading ideas, which we'll dive into, identified by the National Reading Panel: phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. And they looked at how much coverage was given in instructional programs for each of these big 5 ideas, and they compared data from 2013 to 2020. So here's basically the summary. Over 50% of traditional programs provide adequate instruction in at least 4 of the 5 areas of scientifically based reading instruction, compared to only 35% in 2013. Undergraduate programs are nearly twice as likely to teach scientifically based instructional methods as those graduate programs are. Next, 52% of programs provide instruction in phonological awareness or phonemic awareness, which for all of you out there who are early literacy people, that's that precursor skill for reading success. And then teacher prep programs in Mississippi collectively perform the highest, followed next by Utah. Now, you'll recall on the previous slide, we talked about the fact that Mississippi was the only state to show reading progress in fourth grade from 2017 to 19. And then the last point that I really want to hit hard on is that 53% of traditional programs provide adequate cover for fluency. Yet think about how often teachers assess students' fluency skills. Think of those assessments like running records or miscue analysis, where traditionally the focus of fluency assessments is on rate, with really little to no emphasis on actual reading comprehension. So, I think we can agree that we spend a lot of time assessing fluency, but how much time teaching it with the end goal being comprehension? And I think that generally speaking, most third grade teachers are assessing at some point during the school year oral reading fluency, but how much time can we expect them to actually work on teaching it if only 53% of college courses focus on it? All right, so how has the pandemic impacted this crisis that we know exists, really root causes decades ago? Well, if we look at the National Institute for Early Education Research, they looked at the percentage of time parents reported spending with their child or children at home on literacy activities during the week. And pre-pandemic, parents reported 85% of the time they engaged in at least 3 activities. During the pandemic, it was down to 71%. And we can certainly figure out, probably why, right? Many parents were forced to try and work from home while they helped their child with that online learning. And, another piece of information that was reported in this report in 2021 was the stress level and really the impact that virtual learning and the pandemic in general had on the social, emotional well-being of not only students, but their parents. So we have some researchers here at NWEA, and they're really focused on what school's going to look like come this fall. And what we know based on this school year is that fewer pre-K and kindergarten students were actually enrolled. Many parents made the choice that, well, this is probably not the best year to start my child off on their education career, so to speak. So they kept them at home. So this fall, we're likely going to see larger kindergarten classes. And we know that with larger classes, we're going to have a wider range of ages, abilities, and skills in comparison to other cohorts of kindergarten students. There's another report by some Stanford researchers, and they looked at fluency loss in grades 2 and 3. And what you see here in this graphic, that yellow line represents the typical progression of fluency skills from fall to fall with a cohort of students, 2nd and 3rd grade. Notice that blue line, that represents oral reading fluency in 2nd and 3rd grade, and there is approximately this decline of 30%. So we're not meeting that typical expectation from one fall to the next. And that's likely due to the pandemic. So will students just bounce back on their own? Will it really be like osmosis? Well, no. First off, we know that learning to read it's science, right? And it's challenging, especially English, as opposed to other languages like Spanish or Finnish, because of our orthography. English is really a more challenging language to learn. Number 2, teaching is rocket science. And this is where evidence-based assessments, resources, instructional practices matter. And we'll talk much more about that. And then finally, those students who need intervention but don't get it almost never catch up to grade level. So this is really going to be key, and likely this fall, we're going to see more students in need of intervention. So what can we do? What are those best instructional practices? So let's sort of level set and start off with these big 5 reading ideas identified by the National Reading Panel in 2000. Phonological awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension need to be part of that core reading program. But they're really not to be taught in isolation. They're actually connected. And this diagram is a great one, and most people know it. It's the Scarborough rope. And basically what it's showing us is that learning to read is this multi-dimensional process, and is comprised of really these 2 domains, the language comprehension domain. So think background knowledge, vocabulary, grammar or syntax, verbal reasoning skills, etc. And it sort of meets up with those word recognition skills, particularly phonological awareness, phonics, sight word recognition, etc. Now, what this rope, Scarborough's rope, tells us is that if students are weak in the language comprehension domain, that doesn't necessarily mean they won't ever learn to read. But what research shows is that students are much more likely to struggle. And we know what happens when students struggle. It becomes compounded from one grade level to the next. And we know, we just looked at research in the percent of students, 10 to 15%, who will drop out of school. So what I want to emphasize is this simple view of reading by Goff and Tunmer. Reading comprehension is that ultimate goal. Reading comprehension is a product of 2 factors, decoding and language comprehension. So let's drill down here a little bit. It is not an addition problem, right, that you see here. This is a multiplication. There's a real algorithm at play. So if a child has weak decoding skills and we just add more skills in that language comprehension domain, it's not necessarily going to make up the difference of those decoding skills. They both play a vital part in this reading comprehension process. So when we talk decoding, we're talking phonological awareness, phonics, and word recognition. So let's drill down about phonological awareness. So in case you're unaware, phonological awareness is this skill that usually involves listening, okay, where students are able to hear the sounds in words, and those sounds are known as phonemes. So one such skill is to be able to identify the syllables in the word strawberry. Another skill is to be able to identify each individual phoneme or sound. So in chip, there are 3, ch, I, p. And then finally, there's this skill that allows students to be able to partner together in tandem those sounds with the appropriate letters. It's like doing that crosswalk. If we look at phonics, we're talking about graphemes, or the letters associated with those phonemes or sounds. So we know that the word cup is comprised of 3 letters, and phonics involves not only hearing that middle vowel sound, but identifying it with the correct letter. Same thing for can. And then we have the ability to segment and to swap out letters and sounds, cap to can. Those are higher level skills. So what we know is that teaching reading is a science, and it needs to be explicit and systematic. Well, what does that mean? You probably heard that phrase quite often. It means that it's planful, it's intentional, it's not haphazard. It's teaching the sequence of letter sounds and patterns, and sequencing and teaching the skills along a continuum. Easier skills first, more challenging skills later. In addition, what we know is that it's important to use evidence-based strategies. And I want to be careful to sort of differentiate between evidence-based and research-based. Anything can be research-based. When we say evidence-based, meaning we've looked at what that research actually suggests, and it's positive. So we know that the International Dyslexia Association, as well as the International Literacy Association, as well as National Reading Panel, et cetera, really tout the importance of teaching reading, and that the science matters. It needs to be systematic, explicit, and you need to teach all 5 of those big ideas. So how can assessment support this action plan? Well, what we know is that assessment really matters, and this is certainly not a new idea, right? And assessment really marks the beginning of the instructional journey. Lots of thought leaders, those you see here on the screen, Guskey, Stiggins, Bloom, et cetera, have done a lot of research on the importance of using assessment data to formulate your best instructional practices. It starts there. You might be familiar with the mantra, you can't weigh your cows, or excuse me, you can't grow your cows by weighing them. And that's very true. And so therefore, we have to be able to use the data from those valid assessments to change up our practices with the hopes of closing any gaps students have. Remember that probably most of us learned the importance of sharing, and we learned that in kindergarten. We need to share data. Not only, data is not only just for teachers or even parents, but it's for students as well. They need to see where they are along the skills development continuum. And the last point I want to make here is we're all on the same team. So my youngest is a high school senior. He'll be graduating in a couple of weeks, and he plays 3 sports, and we're in baseball season. And part of his practice regimen is looking at the highlights, his game highlights, and figuring out what went well, what didn't, what should he change up during practice before the next game, before he has to perform again. And he's not only looking at that, but his coaches are as well. That's exactly what needs to happen in the classroom, these data conversations with those stakeholders. So how might you go about selecting an appropriate assessment? Well, start with these 3 basic questions. What is it that you want to know? Why do you want to know it? If you know something, how will it change your instructional practice? And how can you best discover what it is you want to know? So for those of you out there who may be unfamiliar with our MAP Reading Fluency assessment, I'd like to take sort of somewhat of a dive into it, give you an overview and talk about how this particular assessment addresses each of the big 5 reading ideas and helps teachers make informed decisions so they can close those gaps for students. So in 2001, I was teaching first grade. I had 27 first graders, and I used to administer DIBELS and the DRA assessment to all students one by one. It took a full week. So our school district hired substitute teachers so that we could assess all of them. And then we had to look at the data and group students and figure out what our next steps would be. Well, that's not the case with MAP Reading Fluency. MAP Reading Fluency can be administered to an entire class of students at once. The actual test time takes approximately 20 minutes, and everything is done automatically for you, the scoring, the reporting, etc. We're going to provide those objective results so that you know that you can feel confident about the data that we're giving you. And we're going to provide that actionable data so you're ready to take those next instructional steps. So what is it? Well, it's an online assessment for students in grades pre-K through 5. You certainly can roster it to students in grades 6 through 8 who are reading significantly below grade level. We partner with Languametrics, so we're going to use their speech recognition technology, and it automatically records student audio, scores it, and then archives all of that data, including the recording, for future playback. So what does it measure? Well, it's going to measure everything that happens while a student is learning to read. So it's going to measure oral reading, literal comprehension, and foundational reading skills. It's a screening assessment for 3 times per year, fall, winter, and spring. And we also have progress monitoring options for those students likely in an intervention program. It's available in both English and Spanish, and it can be administered in person or really from wherever students call classroom. And this fall, we're really excited to launch our K-3 Dyslexia Screener test form within our MAP Reading Fluency assessment, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. If you're familiar with MAP Growth, it's a great complement to this assessment. Together, they provide the most complete picture of your students' reading skills. So as I mentioned, this is a very unique assessment. We embrace the holistic view of reading. We are going to assess fluency in the context of comprehension. And for students not yet reading connected text, we'll assess their foundational skills. It's adaptive. So we're going to provide excellent, efficient data on students reading above, below, or at grade level. When I administered DIBELS, I had to give the same passage to all 27 first graders, even if they were reading above or below grade level. And the message I communicated to the students by winter and spring was, well, I know this is an easy passage for you. Just read it as fast as you can, thinking that the only way to actually measure their growth in reading is by increasing their rate. And that's just not true. So we're going to provide an oral reading rate or a foundational skills profile for every student, and it's aligned to true growth in reading. We're going to increase the text complexity for those fluent readers, and we're going to check their comprehension because that's the goal of reading. So what I want to highlight here are some of the data you get in the foundational skills assessment. Here's actually an item where we're assessing phonological awareness. Students will hear a word or a phoneme, and they'll be asked to select the picture that matches. This is a phonics item where they'll hear the word hat, and they'll be asked to select the letter that corresponds with the final sound. Now, what I want to do is show you the data. This is an overall student report. So let me go ahead and pull apart each section. In the top summary, you're seeing those 2 domains. So remember, we talked about the simple view of reading, that decoding and language comprehension domain. So I want to focus on decoding. What you see are some color codes here. This student is performing below grade level for phonological awareness. And notice the yellow A, the student is approaching grade level expectations for phonics. Their language comprehension skills seem secure, and I'm going to dive into what language comprehension looks like in just a moment. In the center of the report, this is where the utility comes into play. We are going to highlight each student's zone of proximal development so that you know exactly where that gap is along the skills development continuum for phonological awareness and for phonics. We're also going to link to the Florida Center for Reading Research. You might notice these blue hyperlinks here. So we're going to locate a just right activity for you aligned to the student's identified ZPD level. So we're taking the guesswork out of the equation and populating that activity that you can even print out and share with families. All right, so what kind of action do we need to take so that students can read really rich texts at grade level and be able to understand them? So let's talk about that. So I want to go back and bring up that simple view of reading again. Okay, so we've talked about the decoding domain and the language comprehension, right? There's decoding. Language comprehension domain encompasses things like vocabulary, syntax, which is grammar, and background knowledge. So when we talk about developing the language comprehension domain, one of the best ways, especially for very young children, is to engage in read aloud. So if we look at these examples here, first for syntax, take a look at this sentence. Even on the most beautiful days in the whole year, the days when summer is changing into autumn, the crickets spread the rumor of sadness and change. And if we look at vocabulary, we must advertise Wilbur's noble qualities, not his tastiness. Do either of these passages sound familiar to you? They might. These come from Charlotte's Web. When my daughter was 3 years old, she certainly wasn't reading. And she actually was attending a daycare pre-K center or pre-K program. And I was reading aloud to her Charlotte's Web because I knew that at a young age, I could help develop that English language syntax and develop her vocabulary by reading out loud. So I was sort of bolstering up her language comprehension domain. Lily Wong Fillmore talks about the need for students to engage with juicy sentences. So you can probably imagine what she means by juicy sentences, sentences that are filled with complex syntax and great vocabulary. And what we know from researchers is that in pre-K to second grade, oral language comprehension predicts later reading comprehension. So it's so important to read to students above their instructional reading level so that we can develop that language comprehension domain for them. We know that complex text is important because if you think about it, you can't learn new vocabulary words from text where you already know all the words, right? And written language tends to use more complex grammar than oral language. So it's important for students to be able to read language. And we know that building content knowledge, or what we call background knowledge, makes it easier to build additional content knowledge. I want to call attention to Rudine Sims Bishop. She is from The Ohio State University, which is where I did my undergraduate work. And she talks about the importance of culturally responsive education. And she talks about this notion of windows and mirrors. And we know that books sort of open up windows to new worlds for students, worlds, places that some students may never have the opportunity to personally visit or experience. But what she says is those same books are often mirrors, and students need to see themselves in those books. There's so much research on the importance of that. But when we look at those mirrors, oftentimes those mirrors aren't for students who are students of color or who are marginalized, come from different cultures. And so if you're looking to be able to find those books so that all of your students can experience those mirrors, here are some options here. And we'll be sharing this webinar with you, so you'll have access to this. In addition, we know the importance of social emotional learning, and here are just 3 books that really talk about those important social issues like grief, and forgiveness and, how to be accepting of others who are different from us. All right, so we've talked about the decoding domain, this importance of the language comprehension domain, and having students be able to not only experience windows, but mirrors. But what about fluency? Where does fluency play a role? Well, fluency is like that bridge. It's where the decoding domain and the language comprehension domain meet. And we can develop students' fluency with lots of practice. We have to work on their prosody. We have to teach them what a good reader sounds like and how to engage in voice inflections and appropriate ways to read particular sentences that have exclamation points or question marks, all of those inflections, right? And we have to give them multiple opportunities to perform. So why is this important? Well, when I was teaching elementary school, I was tasked with finding each student's instructional reading level. Why? Well, because I was going to pull them into guided reading groups based on their instructional level, give them books at their level. Well, what happens when a student's instructional level, so let's say my colleague, Jessica, has an instructional level of 300 lexile, but the grade level text that she needs to be successfully reading is at the 600 level. Well, what do? Do I just give her an easier text at the 300 level or lexile? Well, the answer is no. And here's why. There was a study in 2018 by the New Teacher Project, and they titled this the opportunity myth. So they observed students, and they found that students were meeting class or teacher expectations 71% of the time. So we might think, okay, great. Almost 3/4 of the students are meeting expectations. But when they looked at what those expectations were, they weren't grade level expectations based on grade level standards. In fact, only 17% of the time were students meeting grade level standards. So to go back to my example, Jessica might be successful with a 300 lexile book, but that's not going to get her where she needs to be with that 600 lexile book. So what do? How do I help Jessica successfully read that text at grade level? Well, this is where scaffolding comes into play. And scaffolding is often addressed using fluency as that instructional tool. And so by allowing her multiple opportunities to read that text, by front-loading, pre-teaching vocabulary, reviewing phonics rules, really allowing her to engage with that text more than once is definitely going to help her be successful reading what she needs to be reading at grade level. But don't just take my word for it. There's plenty of research out there that talks about fluency instruction that emphasizes oral reading of grade level text with appropriate scaffolding will actually promote reading development in young learners. And what also was discovered is that practicing reading aloud, say, for example, that grade level text, it was beneficial. It didn't matter the level of the text. What mattered was the opportunity for students to be practicing and engaged and working on their fluency. In addition, what researchers have found is that fluency interventions and fluency instruction not only improved, students' ability to accurately, automatically decode passages, but it also improved their reading comprehension, which is the goal. So how can assessment data support this action plan of providing appropriate scaffolding? Well, let's take a look. What is it that teachers need to know to help their readers? They need to know if they're reading automatically. When they see a word, can they decode it with automaticity? Can they decode it accurately? Or are they just word calling any word on the page? How is their actual reading comprehension? Because that's the goal. And what type of scaffolding is needed? so that, Jessica can read the grade level text? And is the student growing in her ability to handle more challenging texts with understanding? This is the type of information that teachers need to know in order to help students grow as readers. So if we know that reading comprehension is the ultimate goal, we have to uncover the weak links. So if we go back to that fourth grade NAEP data, think about it for a moment. If we have fourth graders who aren't reading at grade level, meaning they're unable to comprehend, we have got to uncover the weak links. Where are those skills gaps? Is it down in decoding? Maybe they haven't secured those phonological awareness skills. So your assessment needs to be able to provide data on where those weak links are. What we know is that research and proactive instructional practices matter. We have to rely upon our research findings on which assessment tools and instructional resources and practices are truly effective, right? We don't want to spend our money and waste our time on things that aren't proven to be effective. Number two, think about that RTI triangle, right? So 80 to 85% of our students should successfully be learning to read in that base, in that tier 1 reading program. Unfortunately, that's not typically the case. And so if that's your scenario, if you have sort of that inverted triangle where more of your students need an intervention, then you really want to start analyzing your instructional practices, resources, and assessments. And third, what we know is that if we prevent reading difficulties in that K-3 space, it is so much more cost-effective and efficient than trying to remediate things down the road. So I want to take a look at MAP Reading Fluency and look at the types of data and type of reporting you get for students who are reading passages. So in MAP Reading Fluency, students will read a passage. They'll actually read 3. You see the example of the passage on the screen, and then they will read or they will see a series of 6 multiple choice questions to answer. Here's a report of Lorraine. She's a 2nd grade student and she has oral reading data. I'm going to break apart some of this report so you can see the data that you'll get. First off, we're going to tell you Lorraine's oral reading rate because we know that reading rate is a part of fluency and it's important. It's just not the end goal. We are using Hasbrook and Tyndall 2017 norms, and Lorraine is meeting grade level expectations for the fall of 2nd grade. So that seems pretty secure. In addition, we're reporting out a new metametrics Lexile framework. This is called the oral reading level, and it looks at the student's ability to decode automatically and accurately passages. And so we know here from metametrics that a typical, say science or social studies passage in 2nd grade has an oral readability measure of 380 Lexile to 580 Lexile. Well, Lorraine's Lexile oral reading measure is 100. So what this is telling the classroom teacher is there's going to need to be significant scaffolding in place so that Lorraine can read that social studies passage at grade level. Some pre-teaching, reviewing phonics, multiple opportunities to read that passage. In this section of our report, I've pulled out 2 of the passages Lorraine read, and you can see the data we populate, her reading rate, her accuracy, as well as her comprehension score. And in addition, you can review her audio by clicking review audio and follow along, listening to her recording and seeing the actual text she read. This coming fall, I mentioned earlier that we're going to include our Dyslexia Screener option. So what is it exactly? Well, it's a new test form that you can choose to assign. And we're going to use a predictive model that looks at all of the data from the student's testing session, and it will populate a predictive flag if the student's scores are low enough to warrant additional follow-up, and perhaps, an intervention might be needed, communication with families. And what we're clear on is that this is a screener. This is not a dyslexia diagnosis by any means. So we're not diagnosing for dyslexia or any reading disability. We're just taking the guesswork out of the equation and saying, okay, based on all the students' scores, they were low enough to cause sort of some concern, right? You need to spend a little more time with the student, dig a little deeper. In addition, we're adding our rapid automatized naming measure, and we'll be reporting out the students' outcomes for that as well. Here's what that class report will look like. We can see that there are 4 students who have been flagged based on their performance outcomes. And so teachers will want to take a deeper look at those students. And again, just reiterating that this is not a diagnosis, and that explicit systematic instruction in those big 5 reading ideas will be key for those students. All right, so I am going to wrap it up here for us. And what I want to just remind everyone is that earlier I shared with you those NAEP 4th grade reading data, and that it suggests only 35% of students are reading at or above the proficient level. So when a student isn't demonstrating reading comprehension, we have to identify that root cause. Right? And so we have to be able to rely on the science of reading and understand what works and what really matters when we're talking about teaching children to read. We know that the big 5 ideas need to be taught systematically and explicitly. And we also know that reading high quality text with all students matters. And it's about equity, right? And you can't have equity in your classroom if students are being denied grade level text because, oh, they'll just be too hard for them to read. So we know that assessment data needs to inform your instruction and determine what type of scaffolding needs each student has. All right, so with that, I'm going to pause and open it up for any questions or comments that you might have. In case anyone is wondering, I've talked just briefly about our Dyslexia Screener. The Dyslexia Screener will be part of the MAP Reading Fluency Assessment, so there is no additional cost for this Dyslexia Screener test form. It will just be one of the test form options that teachers will have. And, should you have additional questions, if you'd like more information about the MAP Reading Fluency Assessment, you can certainly reach out to Jessica or myself, anyone at NWEA, and we'll be happy to answer questions, share more information, etc. Jessica, do we have anything else here? Any other questions in the chat?
There are not any additional questions in the chat. I want to thank you all for joining us today. I did drop in the chat my email address. So if you do have any further questions or needs at any time, please feel free to reach out to me. We are happy to help. Jonathan also dropped in the chat a post survey or a post session survey. So please take a moment to fill that out, as well as he dropped in some upcoming NCEA professional learning opportunities. As always, NWEA is a very proud sponsor to work in conjunction with NCEA as a corporate partner. And so supporting our Catholic schools, both of us having this nonprofit mission to really help all kids learn, as well as grow children in their faith. So again, thank you for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to Jonathan.
Thanks so much, Jessica. Big thank you to NWEA for your time today. We appreciate having you. And thanks to everyone joining us both live today and those who will be watching the recording. If you found this helpful, feel free to share the webinar with your friends and colleagues. The registration link will be the same as what you used before, but we'll provide more information about how to access the on-demand recording in our follow-up with some additional resources from NCEA as well as NWEA. So thanks so much, everyone. Have a blessed rest of your day. God bless.